Okay, yeah, you can hear me okay with that? Okay, welcome everyone to this panel exploring who is imagined as the revolutionary subject of agroecology. Thoroughly enjoyed this morning's session, and we have a fantastic panel lined up. And I'll let them introduce themselves in a few moments, but just briefly, I'll give an introduction to the session's topic and super briefly of who I am. I'm a member of the Root and Branch Collective. I'm a part-time farmer in the southwest of Wales and a full-time PhD researcher at Lancaster University, looking at how farming and farmland is changing at this moment with new policies, natural capital markets, and the like. So, agroecology has a political element at its core, but sometimes that politics can be quite liberal. So, what does it mean to have a revolutionary subject of agroecology? And how do we contend with the questions of race, class, and gender? The first session today talked about land, and we're here at the Architectural Association, so why talk about labour? How does this relate? Well, who is going to undertake the political and practical work of land reform? Or as Naomi put it this morning, of land tenure change? And who are those land reforms for? And then what about the role of the small farmer? So I spent a lot of my work and time defending the family farm against, in the kind of more policy space, or whatever, around my research against poorly implemented new government policies like the recent inheritance tax or the changes to subsidy schemes that are bleeding hill farmers dry right now. That said, if we are considering a revolutionary approach to agroecology, I don't believe that revolutionary subject is the typical farmer. I'm in favour of transitioning already existing farms to more agroecological practices. But personally, I don't think this is going to be anywhere near enough. That will never be sufficient, as agroecology inherently requires many more hands on the land. After all, the UK imports around half its food, we have decreasing levels of biodiversity and relies massively on exploited and super exploited labour. Something we'll talk about at some length in this panel. We need more land workers and we need more power in the hands of land workers. And there is a tension here within the UK agroecology movement around class power that we need to work through. I think it's interesting to note that a lot of agroecological farms mimic conventional agriculture in resorting to super exploiting labour in order to maintain viability. And I've used the word a few times, but super exploitation is something like where workers are employed at a wage that is below what is required for their subsistence. So their labour acts as a kind of subsidy to their employer and to capital in general. And maybe later in the panel we can think a little bit about self-exploitation on farms, which in practical terms is unpaid labour on family farms. On top of this, 99% of farm owners and managers in the UK are white. And patrilineal inheritance, the passing on of farms to sons, not daughters, is still a thing. These are some of the reasons why land reformers must consider more than just the land itself and must consider land relations within a broader picture of social relations and class, race and gender. This is why I think it's important to broaden the movement's base beyond just pursuing reforms that either defend small farmers or look to create a modest number of new small land-owning farmers. We need an ambition and desire that meets the challenge of the huge and historical task that awaits us. Do we want a revolutionary agroecology or a reformist green capitalist agroecology? So with that, what is to be done? And we'll move on to our brilliant panelists, and I know that we have plenty of ground to cover. And the way this session will work is that we'll have more of a discussion amongst the panel, and later on I'll ask for audience questions and participation. So please, would you just give a quick intro to who you are?
Sure. Hi, my name is Catherine McAndrew. I work for the Land Workers Alliance, which is a union of small farmers, peasants and land-based workers in the UK, which is affiliated to Via Campesina, which is an international organisation of peasants and agricultural workers unions involved in 81 different countries with 200 million members. My area of work for the Land Workers Alliance is I'm the coordinator of the Migrant Workers Solidarity Project, which is a project and a campaign which is oriented towards sort of improving the conditions for migrant farm workers in the UK's supermarket supply chain. And this involves looking at conditions for workers employed in the UK on the seasonal worker scheme, which is a new temporary migration program, and also as well looking at the conditions for workers primarily in Spain, Morocco and Italy. Yes.
I mean, do you want me to do the full introduction based on those questions, or just a short one?
Just who you are for a moment.
Fantastic. My name is Claire Attanon. I am a land worker and a writer and a coordinating member within SALT. SALT stands for Solidarity Against Land Trade. Oh, God. I did it. I can't believe I did it. We talk endlessly about how that slips out and how it's the absolute opposite of what we're trying to do. Solidarity across land trades. And we are a grassroots trade union, the only trade union that represents workers in the alternative agriculture movement specifically, although that is not the sum total of our membership. And we are about 3 years old, and actually we'll get more into the detail of that later, so I'll just let Nell speak. Try and get our name right.
So hi everyone, my name's Nell Benny. I'm a PhD student at Lancaster University, looking at labour conditions on agroecological farms in the UK. And for the last 2 years, I've been organising with SALT as well. So I'm in the middle of my third research project, looking at pay and working conditions of landless labourers in the UK, and I can talk a little bit in more detail about them in a bit. But I've been focusing specifically on instances of underpayment, so basically what Alex was talking about earlier about the super exploitation of workers on agroecological farms and how these workers are providing a subsidy for the sector. My current PhD research is also integrating the experiences of farm owners and business owners and talking about their self-exploitation. So kind of the two prongs to this unpaid subsidy, which is really supporting the agroecological sector.
Brilliant, thank you. So then, Catherine, we'll start with you. Based on your research, do you think you could help give everyone an idea of what it's like for a migrant worker in British farming?
Sure. So in sort of summer 2023, we published in conjunction with several other organisations, including the New Economics Foundation, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, Sustain and Focus on Labour Exploitation, the Debt, Migration and Exploitation report, which investigated conditions for farm workers recruited via the seasonal worker scheme, which is a new temporary migration, well, a relatively new temporary migration program, which governs the arrival of up to 45,000 migrant workers to the UK each season. It was mentioned earlier, I think, that there's around 400,000 people employed in agriculture. I think that was the number given in the session previously. About 60,000 of these are sort of migrant farm workers, migrant wage workers, and so you can see how large a proportion the seasonal worker scheme makes up. So under the terms of this visa, so the way that people are recruited on the seasonal worker scheme, they're typically recruited from, at the moment, Central Asian countries, so Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and also as well South Asian countries like such as Indonesia. So there was a pivot from recruitment primarily from Ukraine. So the scheme started around 2019, and then most 90% of the workers recruited on it came from Ukraine. Then when the war broke out in 2022, there has been a pivot to Central Asia. So under the terms of this scheme, in order to come to the UK, workers have to pay a visa application fee of £298 and the cost of their flights and medical checks. So that means that workers from Central Asia are usually paying around £1,500 to get here, which, considering £1,500 may not seem extremely large amount to people in the UK, but considering the sort of difference in sort of the powers of local currencies, this is several months' wages for workers. And so workers typically get into, they either sell possessions, sell land, or get into or take on debts. And in addition to those costs, they often pay informal broker fees to sort of like third parties. So the way that the recruitment works is 6 recruitment agencies in the UK are given the license by the government to recruit workers under this scheme. And then typically what will happen is they'll set up an office in one of these countries, and then sort of that office will then subcontract to local recruitment firm who will then subcontract further to local agents. These local agents will go around sort of villages, towns, and say to people, hey, I've got links to a British recruitment agency that can get you to the UK, and you can earn thousands of pounds doing agricultural work. Give me a couple £1,000 to your passport and I'll arrange it all for you. And then of course, once the broker's got the passport, then they can demand more money, and ultimately it means that the worker arrives with a huge amount of debt. And a worker that arrives with debt, it's very hard for them to leave a bad employer. Furthermore as well, so when the worker arrives in the UK, this recruitment agency, the UK recruitment agency known as a scheme operator, is their visa sponsor. So they're the ones ultimately responsible for whether they're allowed to stay in the UK, and also ultimately which farm they work at. It's the scheme operator that decides whether that worker is allowed to transfer to a different farm. And so that means that if a worker could be having a bad time on a farm, not being treated very well, but they don't have the right to change employer or to leave their job in the same way that domestic workers would be able to. And so that's another reason, another element of sort of like forced labour within this scheme. And so these, and also as well, also if the worker gets dismissed, if the worker gets fired, is increasingly an issue. So it used to be that workers used to be all on 0-hour contracts. Now there's a requirement for workers to be paid, because what was happening with workers before is that essentially workers have to pick to a target. And this target is usually around 20 kilos of fruit picked an hour, and it's typically horticultural farms, large soft fruit farms. They are the big employers of migrant farm workers. And so if those workers were not on paper, the idea is that if you pick above this 20 kilos an hour target, it's a bonus. So in addition to your hourly wage of £11.49 as the minimum wage is now, you would get a bonus if you picked more than that. But in reality, actually, it's a minimum. And if you don't consistently reach that target, it used to be when it was a 0 hours contract, you just get stopped offering hours. Like, if you were picking slowly, the manager would say, you're picking slowly, you're not meeting target, get back to the caravan, you're not going to get paid for the rest of the day. And then if that consistently happened, you wouldn't be being offered hours at all. So you'd be stuck in a caravan, paying rent to the farmer. There's a rent of around, I think it's £9.99 a day, so about sort of 60, I think it's about 60 or 70, it's about 70 quid a week. And so that actually means that, these farm workers who are, you've got about 6 farm workers to a caravan, and all of those farm workers are paying this amount, and these are old caravans that are bought from sort of haven holiday camps. They're very old, they're about 20 years old. The state of them is atrocious. This is the thing that farm workers are really, really pissed off about at the moment, is how poor the accommodation standards is, and no one is responsible for monitoring the accommodation standards. It's a legal grey area. So unlike rental accommodation, it's local authorities that are responsible. So, but these are workers that are paying collectively £1,800 a month. It's often in places like Scotland, in Fife. These caravans are some of the most profitable rental properties in the area, and the local authority does not have the responsibility to monitor them. So workers, if they're not picking fast enough, they get sent back to caravan, they get stuck, not earning any money, with a huge debt that they're not paying off, paying more and more rent to the farmer, not having enough money for food, and it was causing a lot of problems. But now that 0 hour contracts have been kind of abolished in this area, it's now a minimum of 32 hours, farmers are now increasingly resorting to dismissals as a way of dealing with this. So if you're not picking fast enough, or in a case that I've been quite involved with of Indonesian workers this year, there was 5 Indonesian workers employed at Haygrove Farm in Herefordshire. There was simply not enough fruit. They arrived around sort of mid-June. It was quite, as you remember, it was quite a cold June, quite a wet June, and the fruit simply wasn't ready. And so instead of paying the workers for time whilst they were waiting for the fruit to get ready, the farm simply dismissed them. And then, as a result of this, extreme pressure was placed on these workers to leave the UK. Of those 5, 3 of them did. And now they're dealing with the fact that they're only in the UK for 6 weeks. They didn't earn nearly enough to pay off the £2,700 it cost them to get here. And that debt is like an albatross around their neck. It's ruining their lives. So, and of course, so all of these factors of sort of like, not being able to leave the farm, the huge debt, the huge punishment of not only losing your job, but being sent home with a huge debt around your shoulders, all of this results in extremely poor working conditions. So you often have situations where workers are working 14 hours a day, under extreme pressure to pick as much as possible. They also, as well, don't have access to healthcare in the same way that domestic workers do. So, like, of course, this is the no recourse to public funds thing. Officially speaking, they're meant to have health insurance provided by their recruitment agency, but they often can't access this. So often, like, I mean, there's a particularly horrifying story of a worker having to remove one of their teeth themselves because they didn't have access to a dentist. So yeah, and of course, all of this results in, actually when we look at who is profiting from this exploitation, who's profiting from 14-hour working days and forced labour and the fear that farm workers are under, that if they get dismissed, and often they are threatened with dismissal and deportation if they complain about their conditions. Who's profiting from all of this? Well, we covered this in our report, and we found on a case study farm of the value of the fruit that this farm produced. Around 54% of that value, so it produced about 24 million punnets in a season and had a market value of about £50.7 million. 54% of that went to the supermarket, of which about 5% was profit. 26% went to the farmer, of which about 2% was profit, so about £22 million, I think it was. And then 14% of that figure went to the 1,200 workers that were employed on this farm. Of that 14%, they got to keep about half of that. So they got to keep about 7.6% of the value of the fruit that they planted, they picked, and they harvested and packed. The rest is taken up by the cost of subsistence, the cost of rent, the cost of migration, and the cost of paying off those illegal fees as mentioned before. I'm going on quite a lot. Should I let others come in?
No, it's a fantastic overview. Thank you.
Yes, if you want a copy of this, I've got a couple in my bag. Let me know. I got loads printed, so yeah.
Thank you. No, that was a brilliant overview. And I got a few questions I might ask Claire on some of that. Claire. Would you please introduce us to the work of SALT, what you do, and why you joined it, and your role as well within that?
Absolutely do that. I'm going to get our name right this time. Sorry about that. Let everyone down. Let me start with a bit. Explain how SALT came to be. SALT is about 3 years old, I think now, and I would say it was about a decade in the making, and many of our coordinating members have, over that period of time, experienced various issues in the workplace. I can talk about personally, I've experienced illegal contracts, overwork, racial discrimination, and abusive management, and so much of those conditions are very much normalised within the alternative agriculture sector. And when I was experiencing those personally, I could desperately have needed a union, and there wasn't one to turn to. And in 2022, there was a report that was released, that was created by Lion, Black Roots and Ubele, called Roots into Food Growing, and which looked at the kind of systemic issues within the alternative agriculture sector that created barriers for those who wanted to participate in growing food in this particular way. And in fact, I was a participant in the research aspect of that, and one of the outcomes, or one of the recommendations, more rightly to say, was that a union was needed. And actually it has been something that, like I said, had been, I think, in the workings for a time, and as a result, SALT was born. For a couple of years, well, there was a year before I got involved. I've been involved for about a year and a half now. And I mean, let me look at my notes. About a year ago, we affiliated with the Bakers Union, which is Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union. We decided that affiliation was the right path for us to go down in order to actually associate ourselves with a existing trade union, a parent union, so that we would be able to offer our membership actual trade union membership, because most of the organisations that are part of the alternative agriculture landscape don't specifically represent workers' interests. And so as a result, the conversations about what a just food system looks like, what appropriate agroecological approach to radically imagining our food landscape often conflates both the interests of a business owner or a landowner, enterprise owner, as well as a worker. And so because of that, we realised that the collective ought to be a trade union specific. And so by affiliating with Bakers Union, not only are we aligning ourselves with other food workers within the sector, so not just people who are working within agriculture or alternative agriculture, but also food production workers across the gamut, from working in production, working in factories. We are actually able to offer our members representation in the workplace, support, advice, and legal advice should they need it, which is something that up until SALT's inception wasn't actually accessible to workers in this sector. Additionally, the way that we organise voluntarily. All of us are working pretty much full-time alongside other responsibilities, care responsibilities and otherwise. And so we are, we are organising on oxygen and enthusiasm. But ultimately, we are not just only wanting to exist to represent workers who are in the process of dealing with a grievance or dealing with a workplace issue. We are also wanting to participate and bring a worker focus into the conversations about how we imagine our supposedly radically just and inclusive food future. And we sort of participate in lobbying certain organisations and have had great success with that. Now has been at the forefront of a piece of work around traineeships and volunteer work, because as I'm sure you all know, unpaid work and underpaid work is actually the lifeblood of the alternative agriculture sector, and is a justice issue in and of itself, and is something that we are consistently in conversation about and trying to find ways to resist. Personally, I can talk a bit about how I came to this work. So I think that I have always been trying to find this space in which, I've always been land justice minded. Maybe not always. Actually, I've really participated in feeding and upholding the narrative of land work being meaningful work, and thus not necessarily, and internalising and absorbing and effectively subsidising enterprises that cannot subsist without unpaid labour. And there's a very strong narrative within our sector, which I am very eager to disrupt, which tries to convince us that because the work that we do is meaningful, because the work that we do is worthwhile, because it has an environmental, ecological benefit, that those who execute that work should be very grateful to take part in it. And sometimes gratitude is the thing that we're supposed to pay ourselves with, which unfortunately is not what my utility bills will be paid with. And I recognise that because I had a previous career, there are so many of us who are career changers in this space, at a previous career I was able to simultaneously work in a way that I could actually subsist, make money and pay my bills, and then also participate in this land work, whether it was unpaid, underpaid, exploitative, etc. And so I feel like a big part of what motivates me to do the work of organising with SALT is to address the ways in which I participated in creating, not creating, but upholding a magical thinking landscape of this work is so worthy that we ought to all be just doing it for free. And that precarity was something that was like a necessary externalization that we were all to absorb, and it still is. So yes, what else is there to say? I think I've probably covered everything I wanted to say, and I'm sure we'll come to more in our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, that was excellent, thank you. I'll come on to Nell then.
Sure.
You've done research into exploitation agroecological farms, as you've mentioned, both for SALT and for your PhD. Could you please just speak to us about some of your research findings, whether that's the SALT Workers' Inquiry or your academic research as well?
Sure. So yeah, as I said, I've been researching small-scale alternative agroecological farms for about 3 years, and been seeing on these farms that the role of workers, well, not just on the farms, but also in the movement in general, that the role of workers and the needs and the issues that are affecting workers has been typically ignored or not really addressed within the kind of rhetoric or the actions of the movement. So my first research project was looking into these issues of stipend traineeships in the sector, which, if you don't know, they're quite widespread across agroecological farms, both in the UK but also across the global north. And they're a work programme which typically runs for about 6 to 8 months over the summer season. They can be longer. And trainees are ostensibly there on a work exchange learning programme, where they exchange their labour for a training in agroecological farming and also sometimes accommodation and board. So in my project that was running in 2022, I found that the average wage, trainees were accepting wages between about £1.80 and £3.60 an hour. And one of my key findings was that these programs, from my perspective, weren't really running as training programs. They were running as entry-level jobs, but these jobs are being paid significantly below the minimum wage. And so trainees absolutely were learning from these roles, but they were learning as you would expect to learn on your first job. So following this work, I then, along with my colleagues in SALT, released a survey last year. We did a workers' inquiry, and we surveyed the experiences of 46 workers on different land trades in the UK. Predominantly, these came from what we'd call an agroecological land business. We also had some gardeners also participating. And in our inquiry, we found, again, widespread underpayment. So we had stipend trainees, really kind of proving that it is a very common route of entry into the sector. Also, many instances of unpaid overtime. We found workers were burnt out, they were stressed, isolated, they had typically quite informal contracts. So many people were working without a contract or with a verbal contract, or in instances of bogus self-employment, which we thought were quite common. And workers were routinely unaware of their rights, so didn't understand that they were being illegally underpaid, potentially, didn't understand that they could organise to change their conditions or where to turn to if they were feeling isolated. And so my work has been really trying to place these conditions, these poor pay, these poor working conditions, within the agroecological sector and place that within the wider narrative of exploited labour within global agrocapitalism, and talk about if agroecology in the UK and the way that we're seeing it, which is, small farms, local food, local markets, diversified little enterprises, if this is being posed as the solution to conventional corporate agriculture, we need to understand that there are significant pressures that are really incentivizing and pressuring farms to super exploit their staff and also to exploit themselves. And so I'm not saying that the conditions of workers on agroecological farms are the same conditions as migrant workers in the UK that Catherine's talked about. They're absolutely not the same. We're not saying this is exactly what's going on, but there are structural similarities and they are absolutely connected. And so if we want to talk about a kind of radical future, we need to think about what Alex was saying in his introduction of moving away from this quite liberal understanding of if we do our own little small project, then that's going to change the world. But to look for answers that are more worker-centered, that are protecting workers' rights and building from community.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay. Brilliant start to the session, I think, with everyone. Just want to follow on with a few more questions. So, Catherine, something important I took from reading your report. I'm not paid to do that. Migrant farm workers are also engaging in resistance, and there are efforts being made towards organising so there's that's already ongoing. Maybe you could talk a bit to that, and then also with this, how do we within the agroecology movement, how do we build broader concrete solidarity with migrant workers, and maybe even beyond that as well. But yeah, those two sides. That makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Also, I just to slightly also just to respond a little bit to what Nell was saying about sort of issues about it's not quite the same as what migrant workers are experiencing, but sort of like the issues you mentioned of widespread underpayment and sort of lack of formal contract felt really familiar to me. Like certainly like a huge issue, as I mentioned, with the sort of like the idea of like, oh, you're meant to be getting a piece rate bonus. So often workers do not get that, even though that's contractually meant to be there. And like so often I'm presented with pay slips where I do all the, which are extremely complicated and extremely hard to understand. And actually when you add all the numbers up, you realise that this worker is like, is not being paid the minimum wage, is not receiving everything that they've said that they're meant to be received. And as well, if workers are also, receiving a contract, but not in a language that they can understand, and certainly not having any understanding or guidance, and often being punished for trying to access support on their rights. So again, I just sort of wanted to say like, hey, I see some similarities here and some commonalities, and also as well in the pressures placed on farms to exploit their workers, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. Anyway, one of the things that we documented in this report, and something that we really wanted to highlight is we really didn't want to, because there's a kind of narrative at the moment of workers being depicted as either just passive inputs into the system, like farms need labour, they don't have enough labour, but forgetting that the people doing this work are individuals with their own interests, their perspectives and stake in the agricultural system. The other element is workers as sort of passive victims, as they're powerless, they're unable to sort of like defend themselves, they need someone to save them, etc. Which again, it ignores the fact that these are again individuals with their own perspectives, interests and agency to change these things. And one of the things that has been really interesting to document is instances of sort of informal wildcat strikes in the horticultural sector. So we have a series of worker testimonies in this report. One of which talks about how on the first day this worker arrived at the farm, they saw all the Bulgarian workers walking off the job, and later on in the day they worked out that these workers are actually gone on strike because they were not receiving their piece rate bonuses. It also talks about a moment when the Indonesian workers all got together and sort of they came up with something called a solidarity pact, which was, if any of us get sent back to the caravan for not picking enough, we'll all go back to the caravan. And if we ever get spoken in a racist way by a supervisor, there's a bit of a tension where, like the supervisors on these farms are typically Eastern European workers who managed to get EU status, and now they're having to supervise workers from Indonesia, from Central Asia, with very different cultures from their own. So there's often some tensions there, and and again also not documented in this report, but last year again at Haygrove Farm in Herefordshire, there was a strike of Chilean workers. Who had been essentially the farm had said they were going to pay for their flights to come here, and then when they finally got there, they said, actually we can't afford to pay for your flights. Now you've got to pay us back for the for the £1,500 we spent on you. And of course, quite understandably, that had a quite adverse reaction from the workers, and so there's an ongoing employment tribunal at the moment about that specific case. So one of the things we wanted to show actually is workers are not just sitting here taking this stuff; they are actually taking actions. And also as well in my sort of work with sort of like the Via Campesina unions in Spain and Morocco, again these are workers. So in Morocco, the minimum wage for agricultural workers is €7 a day. There's a separate minimum wage for agricultural workers that is lower than everyone else's, and this is also in a country with the lowest level of one of the lowest levels of female employment in the world, and agriculture is the sector which is again predominantly employs women. And so again, there was like, I supported a strike in January 2022 of workers who had been dismissed for being members of unions, and they were on strike for 6 weeks from the middle of December to the beginning of January. And on the 2nd of January, one of the workers was killed on the picket line. They were killed in a car accident. The employer had parked cars in front of the farm that they were camped outside, and it was impossible for them to picket safely. It was next to a major road, and a worker whose name was Saba Dina, she was 29 years old. She had 4 kids. She'd been a picker for 9 years, tomato picker for 9 years. And anyway, but as a result of our support from Via Campesina, and especially the support in the UK, we managed to get supermarkets to intervene in that, and the farm eventually caved into all of their demands. So anyway, the point I was going to make with all of this is not only are workers struggling, but also that worker struggles can have like a really really core part of the creation of agroecology, because the conventional agricultural system, and also as well the agroecological system by the testimonies that have been put here, is based on the exploitation of people and land. And the people are being worked at inhuman levels, at unnatural levels. They're being exposed to agrochemicals and getting sick. This is a big issue in southern Spain. I've seen multiple cases of very young agricultural workers falling very sick and dying often because of being asked to spray crops without being given protective equipment. And I think, and as well as like struggling against, these kind of like the effects of industrial agriculture, these struggles as well bring these workers, and indeed the agroecological movement, when they're acting in support of these workers, in direct conflict with the corporations that control the agricultural system. As I mentioned before, in order to win that strike in Morocco, we went to the top of the supply chain, the supermarkets, and held them to account for the conditions on the farm in Morocco, and that was instrumental in winning that dispute. So in terms of like as well, how can the agroecological movement build solidarity with migrant workers? Well, one of the and again, it's as many things as detailed in this report, we were very inspired by the example of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a organisation of farm workers in Florida. And these farm workers, so they were formed in the sort of like the mid-90s, and they spent the 90s going on strike against their immediate employers in Florida, and found that, well, not only are these strikes very hard, we're also finding that the farmers don't necessarily have the money to concede to us. Actually, what we're noticing is that it's the big food companies such as Walmart, Taco Bell, McDonald's. They're the ones who are using their weight in the market, the fact that we have a system where you have essentially monopoly buyers, which all of these farms at the bottom of the supply chain are competing with one another to give these monopoly buyers the cheapest produce picked by the cheapest people possible. So what they ended up doing was building alliances with student and faith groups. And what these student groups would do, especially because their first target was Taco Bell, the idea was like, we're going to force these companies to sign agreements with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that would mandate they would pay extra to fund wage increases for the farm workers, and adhere to a code of conduct designed by the workers, which included things like, we want a break area with shade. We want our gangmasters to be registered and not be like skimming off profits. We want no more wage theft. We want chances to drink water. So very basic things often. But anyway, what the students would do is they managed to force Taco Bell off 18 out of 40 US campuses. This is around 2005, and that kind of made Taco Bell think, well, if we're going to have access to the student market, we're going to have to deal with the workers. We're going to have to concede, and then from that, it's just now. And then Taco Bell was the first domino, but now the Fair Food Program, as it's known, encompasses about 14 major buyers, about 50% of the tomato market in the US. And those extra payments for wage increases have resulted in a 25 to 50% pay increase for the workers. You've seen the end of sort of like issues of forced labour, of sexual harassment against farm workers. It's been pretty transformatory for a region of the US, Immokalee, which was known as ground zero for modern day slavery. And so that's the kind of like that. And so building a direct alliance with farm workers and farm worker organizations is essential in fixing this, and also essential for the agroecology movement to directly confront the corporations that control the agricultural system today. Yeah.
Yeah. Claire, I wanted to link in something here with something Catherine said here, you know, around like people often talk about we need more labour in horticulture, right? Like there's this very instrumentalised way of relating to workers within food policy and farming policy. You know, it's always horticulture sector needs to grow, we need to produce more fruit and veg in the UK, therefore we need more workers, and there's always this kind of language. And I don't know, maybe that ties in a bit with something you shared with me previously, that you're at an event where someone said we're all part of the same working class movement. And I wonder if both those things kind of talk to this blind spot around class and race and gender and power dynamics within agroecology and wider alternative food movement and so on. Wondering, speak to that, please.
Juicy one. It wasn't actually an event. I couldn't. I mean, this was actually in a conversation actually about a forthcoming event.
Okay.
And it was. Well, I mean, I suppose the reason why I brought it up was because I think that it really encapsulates the way in which, particularly within the context of England and the UK more broadly, I think, that there is an inadequate class analysis when it comes to how we conceive of the agroecological landscape, because there is this foregrounding of I could say because my sense of it is because there is a foregrounding of this idea of a common goal, a common good, a thing that we are all working towards, which is ultimately a transformed food system, which has kind of ecological principles at its core, and as such, because those are that vision is considered to be a shared vision that I don't even know if we've already agreed on what that shared vision is, right? And even in the session previously, even our conversation, we talk about agroecological principles, and then sometimes I think to myself, I don't know whether we all are on the same page as to what those are. And as a result of that, the necessity of bringing an understanding of how class and power, wealth, how all of those factors manifest themselves within the landscape in which we are trying to supposedly transform this food system is invisibilized, actually. And I know we can cut stuff out of this, can't we? If you want it to be heard, because I'm about to out you. You shared something with us about wanting to have this conversation at our kind of seminal. If you're not familiar, there's Oxford Real Farming Conference. Sorry, Alex, we can't cut this out. This might just stay in this room. The Oxford Real Farming Conference is happens in January. It happens every year. It was set up as and sorry if I'm telling everybody, you all already know this, but as almost in opposition to the Oxford Farming Conference, which is where the National Farmers Union holds a conference where the conversations about farming today happen. And then the Oxford Real Farming Conference was set up in order to have the conversations about these like kind of other approaches, supposedly radical approaches to farming, and how we were going to transform the system from a perspective of like resisting conventional agriculture. And you wanted to do this conversation. And it was rejected, right? The proposal was rejected. So very sad for you, very sad for us, actually, because I think it speaks to this disinclination to adequately analyze the ways in which the interests of the power dynamic between the employer and the employee broadly speaking, or the landowner or the business owner and those who they employ, whose livelihoods they have agency over, differ and can differ and necessarily have to be brought into the light in order for us to have an adequate analysis of like what upholds this system, who is going to work this land, who is going to deliver this radical reimagined system, reimagined food system. And so yeah, I would love to have had that conversation. Hopefully we're going to have it this year, but I think it speaks to the fact that there is, within so many of these conversations, we are often talking about literal practices and ways of being in dialogue and challenging and resisting the existing system. But whilst we ignore the fact that the entirety of our sector is upheld by invisibilized, unpaid, exploited, often discriminated against, abused labour, we aren't actually going to create a just system whatsoever. And so yeah, that is what brought me to the work of SALT. That is what I feel SALT exists to do, is to finally bring a worker focus into these conversations, necessarily so. And I think that it is also a really useful prism through which we can interrogate the ways in which when we come up with the solutions, these radical solutions that we want to enact in order to create a just food system, we have to analyse the ways in which we have to be able to look at all of it in all of its ugliness, because I think it's very uncomfortable to say to somebody who is working the land, exploiting themselves, and like regardless of what relationship, whether they own that land or rent that land, if they are in the position of being able to offer up a livelihood to somebody else, if the conditions upon which that livelihood is offered up are in contravention with the law, require that worker subsidise it in one way or another, whether it's through their own other revenue streams or through just sheer volume of additional labour that is not compensated for, then yeah, it's a very ugly thing to present, I think, for some people anyway. I've certainly experienced farmers who do not enjoy being told that they are exploiting their labour if they aren't, say, using migrant workers who are so marginalised we can barely see them. Especially when so many of us workers participate willingly, because we are also trying to be part of a system change that we think is meaningful, especially, yeah, as career changers, we're often ending up here in a very idealistic state of mind. And so, yes, I feel like I've wandered quite far away from wherever the question was. But
it's great where you wandered to. Keep wandering as usual.
But yes, I think that the reason why I brought up Oxford is that I think what we're trying to do is bring a very much invisibilised and yes, it's an inconvenient for some people perspective but it's overdue that we actually talk about the ways in which this system is being upheld. If that means that, like, there are human beings, not labour, not units of labour, not anonymous units of labour, human beings who are burning out, who are being, you know, I've just been elected as our health and safety rep. Sounds dorky, but I'm really excited about it because I am very concerned about how we use our physical bodies in our work. You know, and I think it's something that we don't pay a lot of attention to, especially with small farms. There are not health and safety is not at the forefront. Except farms are some of the most dangerous workplaces. Even if it's just not being taught how to lift properly, we are literally breaking our bodies in order to create a so-called radical just food system where we aren't even being compensated adequately. I mean, I work, I don't have sick pay. If I hurt myself, if I just trip, and I don't get paid for the days I don't turn up, you know. And so there are so many justice issues that are totally considered fine for us to all just absorb the impact of in order for us to supposedly reach this promised land. And so, yes, that is that. Can you remind me of the question? Did I answer it?
I think so.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no.
There you go. Sorry, it was a bit of a rant.
For everyone to wander as well.
Okay, good.
You don't have to.
I felt like I just
questions.
needed like a concluding sentence.
You did
and I just really didn't get there. But anyway,
you did answer it.
Thank you very much.
No, you did answer it, and it was where you went was brilliant. So don't worry anymore. So we're talking a lot about working conditions on agroecological farms. Nell, would you like to just paint a bit more of that picture? You've alluded to that there's some similarities and maybe some differences with migrant workers. We've talked a little bit about what it's like on agroecological farms, but not kind of some specifics, or what is it like? Because, you know, yeah, okay, wages are low, but you're living the good life, right? You're in the country, you're in the fresh air, you know, you're enjoying it, and you get meaning, and you get gratitude. But what is it really like? Material conditions.
I can probably premise this as well by I was also a farm worker before doing my PhD, so yeah, have some experience working in the sector as well. And I mean, I can start off with my traineeship research. That, yeah, it was a really interesting project. I surveyed 27 trainees, and they were all working for either for free or below minimum wage. And I found just a huge variation in what they were experiencing on farms. So some of them, and this would be in variation in terms of what kind of training they received, what kind of accommodation they received, what kind of food they received. Just their kind of quote-unquote deal was radically different from farm to farm. And so you had people who'd be very happy in comfortable accommodation in like a cottage, for instance, who had like very structured sessions on the farm, to people who would basically be getting no kind of training that they could really perceive. They were just doing harvesting. And I had one trainee who was living in a tent into the winter months and didn't have access to showers or for anywhere to cook, and so had to go off the farm to be able to just wash themselves and find somewhere to eat. And so, yeah, I also found very wide differences in terms of how they were treated. So a lot of the trainees really enjoyed their experience, but I had a significant minority who had really problematic experiences with their employers. Some of them faced bullying. And interestingly, it was only the people who faced bullying were all women, which was the same in the Roots into Food Growing report as well. The people who were on the traineeships were predominantly white women, and this is something that has been shown in studies focused on the agroecological sector in the UK and also in the global north as well. And also most of them didn't feel exploited, and this was something that I became really interested in as to why people do these, as we're kind of talking about, like what are the non-material benefits which people can gain so that they don't feel like they're being exploited or that their exploitation is kind of being obscured to them. And I found that the provision of some kind of training, even if it's just very informal, as in what you would learn being shown around a farm, I mean, they were all doing essential roles, right? So they're all harvesting, they're all packing, they're all propagating, they're all like, they're doing like real essential seasonal working roles. The provision of having a kind of community around them, and also the real therapeutic benefits of people talked about having their hands in the soil and how important it was for them to be able to do this kind of work. It's something that I've experienced, and I've seen it again and again talking to people in the last 3 years in the sector, both in my organising work and also in my research, just how huge it can be for someone to be able to access land and be able to access nature to the extent where you can really accept conditions which you wouldn't really tolerate in any other industry. And all of these, and people also kind of saw themselves as activists, which I found really interesting as well, because oftentimes they're working on for-profit businesses, but they're still seeing their work as activist work because they're all working towards this agroecological future. And so that meant that like even the idea of being kind of super exploited, or the idea that they are being mistreated, kind of wasn't even possible because they're on an activist project where maybe no one's getting paid in a kind of separate world. But it's obviously very different when there is profit being generated, and well, maybe not profit, but there is definitely money being generated. So this project really led me to become really interested in the potential for this unpaid labour to be providing quite a significant subsidy to the sector, which directly led me to doing my PhD work, which is now, I'm just coming to the end of doing interviews, and I've been interviewing workers and people who are also on business owners and farm owners about the extent to which they're either utilising unpaid labour through their staff, or if they're not paying themselves in their own work. And I'm still kind of formalising the results of that, so I have to see going into next year, like definitively what my absolute findings are. But it seems like universally across the board, everybody is in agreement that yes, unpaid labour is massively key to the sector. And then the Workers' Inquiry report that we did with SALT last year, that was more expansive. So that my research area focus is very much on unpaid labour, but then within SALT, that was not just about payment, that was about everyday experiences of working on farms that Claire's spoken about really beautifully. And yeah, it was actually more shocking than I anticipated. And I think what Catherine said earlier of, yeah, this sounds really similar, like this is, and it is uncomfortable how similar it sounds. And I think where I'm saying the difference lies is in the vulnerability of the worker, and that migrant workers face such extreme and systemic vulnerabilities in the UK, but also globally, that to equate their conditions with agroecological workers who are primarily British nationals does a disservice to their situations, absolutely. But in terms of, yeah, like structurally what's happening, I mean, like really poor caravans, being overcharged for rent, being overcharged for food. I mean, I had someone that I've spoken to recently on my current research project who, yeah, was doing a kind of informal scheme out in the middle of nowhere, and they essentially had to work 7 days a week. They couldn't find a way of getting off the farm. They were really isolated. And this is on a farm that's like an alternative agroecological space. I also want to preface saying that, like, I'm not saying that every single farmer in this sector is like a terrible employer and that people are uniformly having awful experiences. There are definitely farms that are doing great work and are prioritizing workers' rights, but it's just a really informal and massively unregulated sector. And so that there is this idea that if you are doing something that's good, therefore there's no capacity for you to be potentially harming your staff. And that's where we have to kind of like delve into a little bit of uncracking this idea that being agroecological, being ecologically minded, having a social enterprise, therefore means that there's no capacity for exploitative behaviour. Yeah. Was that what you wanted?
Yes,
yeah,
brilliant.
great.
Yeah.
Can I just add something as well?
Sure.
That was really good. Sorry. Do the clap quick.
Yeah.
Clap, everyone.
I feel like I've remembered the point I was trying to work towards. So, just off the back of what you said. So the reason why I brought up your piece and your rejection from Oxford was that in Oxford there are conversations happening about, exemplified by this report here, where we'll talk about migrant workers, and we'll talk about particularly those who are participating in producing food for this country, and we'll talk about farming practices. But there is a piece in the middle where we could be talking about workers, like workers within agroecology and the ways in which they are exploited. But that conversation was like very intentionally left out. And so we'll talk about exploited migrant workers because that's them over there. They're the baddies, they're doing the bad thing, and then there's the goodies over here who are doing the good practices. We're the ones who are figuring it out. And that workers' piece was silenced. And I think, because it was so uncomfortable, and I think there is probably some people who intentionally do not want us to have that conversation, and they're not going to love the fact that it's going to start happening. But yes, that's what I wanted to that is the reason why I called you.
I think that's bang on, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's a good point to make. I could just keep asking questions all day long. I mean literally all day long. 8 hours wouldn't be enough. But I want to open it up to the floor. I'm sure there are people here that also want to be able to ask questions. So, question at the back there, please. I might just take a few and then come back to that.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, let's go. I don't know if it works. But...
Hi.
no?
No.
Is there an on button?
Hello?
There you go.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for your talks. My interest is in supply chains, and I like to follow the supply chain of the problem, the root of the problem. So you spoke about migrants coming here. My inclination is always to say, yes, the migrants have come here, but what was the circumstances or the situations forced those people to leave their country in the first place? Because then otherwise we're just putting a plaster over a big crack, but we're not going to the root of the problem. And a very quick example was when I was looking at the issue of what's happening to arable farmers in Ghana. Arable farmers in Ghana, there is a research paper I found where there are arable farmers whose land has been acquiesced, has been unrightfully taken for mining minerals, because the Ghanaian government or company must have found the land under their farmland was rich in resources. Now, the resources that the arable farmers had their land taken for was not fossil fuels, as most people would suspect. It was for all or some of the minerals that is required for this green transition. So my question is, in all these words of just food and just farming and just transition, there is a common theme between the farmers who've been displaced and lost their land in Ghana, and also there is a common theme between that and the farmers, the small farmers who protested a few weeks ago, whose land is probably going to be bought out by big conglomerates or industry people like Bill Gates, which is both are losing their land for this Green New Deal. One which is to dig up the minerals, and the other one which is to plaster land which should be growing for our food, but it's going to be instead plastered with solar panels and wind turbines. Is there any path looking at what is the source of where, or the problems that's forced those people to leave their land in India and Africa? Is it our demand for these green solutions that's forcing the companies saying, we need to get the resources, but it's under those farmlands, those people's farms? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple and then we'll come back in. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is...
Oh, sorry, the mic. Yeah, sorry. I keep forgetting as well.
Thank you. Thanks. I suppose my question's about that kind of question that's been raised a few times about building solidarity between like workers in the wider food system and migrant farm workers. And I really liked the Florida example. I imagine the nature of the scheme in the UK, where people are here for 6 months. If they do return to the UK, it's 6 months later, and like potentially in like a whole other part of the country, like has its own challenges to building those kind of relationships that like are so essential to that kind of organising. So I was wondering if, like, for everyone, if there's any like touch points in the UK where those relationships are being built, or where you might like foresee those relationships potentially being built.
Thank you. I'll take one more for a second. Just at the back there.
Hi, cheers, great contributions. Just a question zooming out a bit about the stratification of labours. So, you know, when we look at British agriculture in general, what's the sort of proportion of farms that are using this really intensified migrant workers? What's the actual like size of these sectors where we'd be organising like smaller organic farmer workers in these alternate scenes, you know? Because I think those are really important bits of information we need before we can even start talking about revolutionary class coalitions, right? Like, what's the number of agricultural workers here that we're trying to work with, and which ones do we need to prioritise in terms of the fractions we're building? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. We'll answer a few of these, and then we'll come back out to the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can touch on all of this. I've actually got some questions for you guys as well, actually. So in terms of like, you know, I'll tell you a story I saw, or something I saw on Honduras on the Via Campesina delegation there. We went to visit a community of peasants near a town called Guaymaca, and they settled the land around 2008. And in 2009, there was a military coup. There was a coup against the government of Manuel Zelaya, which put in the National Party, which was a right-wing, extremely corrupt and kleptocratic government under Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is now thankfully rotting in a US prison now for drug running. As you can tell, I have quite a lot of contempt for this man. So after the coup, basically, sort of institutions like the Institute for Agrarian Reform, which were like, sort of like managed these land titles, were run by people connected to the coup. And around sort of 2011, the owner of the local gas station approached these peasants and said, hey, this land that you've been quietly growing your food on, it actually belongs to me and I want to sell it to a developer. You've got to leave now. And again, like, he had no proof of this, but the Agrarian Reform Institute that manages land titles, because this guy wanted to make some money and contribute to the development of Honduras, they took his side. So the police went in and demolished. So this community of about 40 peasants, they demolished their village about 5 times. And so then in 2021, they're still there in 2021. The Manuel Zelea's wife, Xiomara Castro, she won the election, so the left is back in power. So the police don't go and demolish people's camps anymore, but the gas station owner hires assassins. So they have to bring in their water at night because they get shot at during the day if they bring in water for their crops. Anyway, the peasants showed me a bit of a shack where a man and his wife were shot in broad daylight by one of these assassins. And this was put to a court, and the court said, well, obviously the land doesn't belong to this gas station owner, but he doesn't belong to you either. And so the result of this assassination was the eviction of half the community. And so that half of the community then went to Tegucigalpa, the capital, and joined the ranks of people selling snacks, offering to wipe the windows of passing cars, etc., and joined the exodus as well to the United States. So that's the kind of like, and this is just one small example in one country which saw after the coup like a wave of peasant evictions and sort of like the burning down of peasant villages by the army and drug running gangs disguised as corporations like the Dinant Corporation. And so this is not just happening in Honduras, this is happening all over the world. And so this sort of like, this seizure of land in order to extract minerals, minerals for sort of like green development, etc. This is happening all over the world and is a major factor in driving people to leave for the global north. But in terms of the people who are coming to be farm workers, though, the way that the migration systems has been set up by Western governments is essentially it only allows the sort of like the sort of most educated and most middle class people to migrate. So the people who can afford the £1,500 plus who can go over. So I had a really interesting conversation with a student from Kazakhstan recently, because I used to have a line for these things saying like, oh well, the UK still has a peasant food system. We just import peasants from abroad in order to do the work. But now I'm realizing that may have been true a few years ago when primarily you got people from rural Romania, rural Bulgaria to do this work. Actually, this is changing now. Actually, we're getting doctors and office workers from Kazakhstan who can afford the flights and visa application fees to come and do this work. And I mentioned it was Indonesian workers who got sacked for picking it. Like partly the reason was there wasn't enough fruit, but one of them, he was a 56-year-old office worker. He should never have been recruited. But of course, like, who else is going to have that kind of money in order to make these trips from countries where, like, one of the other Indonesian workers, he was a fruit seller. He'd make about £100 a month. This is the kind, and again, this is in terms of like, why are people making these journeys? It's because the way that the global financial system is set up, it's based around a series of, they call them the hard currencies: the dollar, the euro, the pound. These are currencies associated with historically rich countries, with huge empires, etc. Like the reason that the UK's currency is so valuable is because it's connected to the UK's financial system, which is connected to all of the former colonial countries. This is why the UK is a very financialized place. It's just like, in the 80s when the US wanted access to Asian and African markets, their financial system did not have the same connections to those markets as the UK's did, so they went through the UK financial system. And so that's kind of, again, that's why people are making these journeys. It's because of the historic and enduring role of hard currencies. So in terms as well about where these workers are employed, etc. So again, as I said, like, I think it's about, we have a maximum of 45,000 visas on the seasonal worker scheme. and about 39,000 are used. And also, as well as a bit of a kind of something that we're noticing is that often these recruitment agencies will over-recruit. They'll recruit more workers than they need, than the farms need, because if they don't keep recruiting like the 15,000 visas each has been allotted or something like that, they're worried they won't get that next year. So often you have workers arriving, often too late in the season to be employed properly, and they'll arrive for they'll be in the UK for 6 or 7 weeks or something like that, and then they'll get dismissed and they'll go home with a huge debt, and and they'll be living with that debt for a very long time. I mean, 2022 was when we had the pivot to Central and South Asia after the Ukraine war, and there are lots and lots of issues with recruitment and informal broker fees, etc. The workers who were screwed over by that are still living with that, and actually a major sort of campaign point that we're working for is sort of compensation for those workers, so they can actually start rebuilding their lives. But in terms of and again, trying to talk a little bit about sort of compositions. So generally, you have it, as I mentioned, it's the horticultural sector. So it's soft fruit, it's asparagus, it's flower production. It's products that need a lot of harvest workers. That's where you're seeing the large numbers of workers employed. I mean, and at the same time, in terms of the number of workers employed, it's quite marginal compared to some other countries. Again, I think we've got about 60,000 migrant workers employed in UK agriculture. Well, in Huelva, in southern Spain, if you ever see, I went there on a delegation. I was very lucky to go there, taken around by SOCSAT, the farm workers union there, and it's just literally, you can just, as far as the eye can see, it's just polytunnels. And in all of those polytunnels, it's strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and blueberries. And so if you ever see a strawberry in a supermarket and it says it comes from Spain, it's come from Huelva, this little enclave in southern Spain. And to pick and harvest all of that fruit, 350,000 tons of fruit come from that area. You need about 100,000 workers. About 30,000 of them are undocumented, living in shanty towns. I went to one where the workers were living in a shanty town constructed out of old polytunnels. There was no water being provided. There was no rubbish collection being provided. In order to drink, what they were doing was using plastic sheet. Again, the same plastic sheets from the polytunnels to catch evaporations. And if you want to see it, I'll show you the picture of it. But one of these workers, showed me the bottle of the water she was drinking. It was green. It was green with agroechemical stains, and it was just so. But yeah, so in terms of the sort of again, so the UK horticultural sector, I think we produce about 18% of the fruit that we eat in the UK, which is, so it's relatively small, and again that means that it's very important, and which is why I think that the links that Land Workers Alliance has to the Via Campesina are so essential in creating an alternative food system, and by creating alternative food system, I mean one of the things I really see as fundamental is actually struggling against the existing food system, taking the fight directly to the corporations that control the existing food system. I think is essential, and one of the reasons, and I'll wrap up in a moment. One of the reasons for that is that actually, the pressure that these corporations place on the farms is a major reason that you have the level of exploitation that you have. So again, as I mentioned, the farm receives about 26% of the value of the fruit it produces, and it's giving about half of that value to pay its farm workers, and it gets to keep about 2% of that value's profit. So how does the farm bridge the gap between the fact that it's got a monopoly supermarket who's demanding, we want this much fruit, and we want it this shape, and we want it to do all of these things, and also we also have the right not to buy from you if we decide not to. How does the farm bridge that gap between the pressure the supply chain places on them and their survival as a business? Well, they underpay their workers, they extract as much rent as they can from them, and and they make them work for 14 hours a day. And I think it's this, you see the same thing as well in the agroecological sector, where it's these are different. These are farms that are trying to build an alternative and show that it is possible to farm things in an agroecological and sustainable way. And I think that's an extremely valuable thing. But those farms are going to be, not only are they not going to be producing as much, because they're not going to have access to agrochemicals, they're not going to have access to the economies of scale, they're not going to have access to the guaranteed markets that supermarkets necessarily have. And they're not as well going to have access to migrant farm workers or farm workers in a country like Morocco, which are paid €7 a day. And also as well, even though they're going to be producing less and it's going to be costing more for them to produce versus like a larger farm, so they've still got to price their produce at least a little bit within the orbit of the supermarket price, because otherwise people aren't going to buy it. People just think, oh, okay, well if your food's so much more pricier than people will accept maybe a little because they're buying for a better product. But then again, that's another element of class where it's like, okay, we're building a farm, but is only going to sell to well-off, well-to-do customers. But so there's an element of like selling to well-to-do customers, but with still not enough to to be financially viable. So how do you bridge the gap? Well, you say to someone, oh well, we'll give you a traineeship where you're not necessarily paid anything. But the question I had for you guys is basically we're really concerned about this in Land Workers Alliance. I mean, we mostly represent small farms, and we're getting really, really worried hearing about how terrible the experience is for a lot of people on these farms. And basically wanted to know, well, what kind of relationships do we need to build with organizations like SALT or with workers in general to ensure that these experiences don't happen? What sort of standards do we need to campaign for and need to introduce to ensure that, the experiences are good ones rather than bad ones, if that makes sense?
I can do a quick answer. I mean, it's a relatively quick answer in that, like, the law already exists, and ultimately we can have a relationship, but I really hope that we will have generative, supportive relationships with all of the organisations who represent small farms, who represent those who run these enterprises. But the baseline is the law already exists as to how workers ought to be treated in this sector, and they are routinely discarded as optional. And so, whilst I don't only acknowledge the truth of what you just described, I live it. I work within that sector. My job is precarious. I do not get the workers' rights that I am legally entitled to, and I am participating willingly, which is unfortunate because I recognise that there's some cognitive dissonance there, given that I'm part of SALT, but I also am trying to pay my bills. So I would say, I mean, it's a relatively simple answer. The fact is, if you're running a business, no matter how you conceive of it, because there's many people who within the kind of small farm movement consider themselves to be anti-capitalist whilst running businesses that are for profit, that the law already exists as to how you should treat your workers. If you expect your workers to be there on a certain day because harvest day is on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and they don't get to choose what day they turn up and whether they could send somebody else in their place, or and they use your equipment, they're on your land, they're workers, and so considering them self-employed is bogus. And so using self-employment in order to deny them sick pay, holiday pay, all kinds of things, reasonable adjustments, all of those things, is illegal. And so ultimately, there are already safeguards there, they're just being disregarded. And so I think that's a really good and necessary and legal starting point.
Thank you. Nell, do you want to add anything to
Sure,
that?
yeah, I can quickly. I think just speaking to Catherine's question briefly, is that in terms of building alliances within organisations that support small business owners and workers, the law already exists, and I think it's also, I feel like it's disrupting the preset narrative of who it is that farms and the way in which they farm. And this kind of speaks to the title of this panel, really, of who is this imagined subject of or the revolutionary subject of agroecology, and trying to break that away from it being like a small business owner, landowner, maybe a couple or a family, and to have the space for dream, like what Christopher said in the last session, of more radical solutions, and solutions that are, as I said previously, kind of worker focused rather than a family unit or a person just doing their idyll somewhere. I wanted to speak to the question previously about like how many workers are we talking about in different sectors and who should we prioritise when we're looking at worker struggles. And it's really interesting. I mean, I don't have the numbers to quantify the workers in agroecology, and a huge part of that is because so many of them are off the books. And so, there's loads of people who don't have contracts, they're just doing things incredibly informally. Also, as far as I know, I don't know anybody who has even tried to quantify how many workers there are. So that could be a new research project, potentially. Anyone wants to do that? That would be great. But I think who should we prioritise is a really interesting topic, and one that I've thought about loads, considering that I've chosen to really focus on agroecological farm workers, considering the huge injustices, as Catherine has very adeptly talked about, with migrant farm workers in this country. And I came to the decision to looking at agricultural land workers because I felt like what future we're imagining is really important, and for me it feels really important to investigate that future, as we've said many times now in this panel, and to really make sure that when we're posing solutions, that those solutions aren't just replicating injustice and inequality, but with more privileged workers, because that just feels like contradictory. And so I wouldn't say that we should prioritise agroecological workers at all, but I think they haven't been included in the discussion, and so that's why my research is relevant. And there's extremely little research in the UK on agricultural land workers. I mean, it's a tiny percentage, right? I mean, I think the organic sector, anybody got any percentage of workers on organics? It's tiny.
Not a lot in the UK.
And then, and then the agroecological is going to be like a fraction of that percentage. So we're talking very small numbers here. But I guess, I'm looking at, trying to work on a different future.
Amazing. Thank you.
I'd ask a question about the green transition.
Because
I'm not really sure if it's been addressed, but this is a big issue for the global south.
I think so. And the final session, we're going to talk a bit about imperialism, so hopefully we can get into some questions around green transitions, extractivism, maybe. It's, you're absolutely right. That this.
Just said, we're going to speak about this later, but the source of migrants coming into the West, global north countries, and our complicit desire for green transition materials. It's like, what's that?
No, I completely agree with you. That there is like a fundamental contradiction.
We're funding and we're facilitating this enslavement of people in the global south, in Africa, in India, all across Africa. So we can have a green transition over here, solar panels, and the farmers saying, right, if you want Bill Gates on the land, we're going to clear off the water. So I don't know how we're not addressing this. That's what this is about.
Well, I agree. I think that these are all intertwined, right? Land, labour, anti-imperialism, or imperialism, colonialism. These are all really intertwined. It's just kind of like this. You have to kind of keep going round and round and kind of bring them into each other, because they all speak to each other in different places. Because I totally agree with you. The demand for a green transition, which is a capital-led transition, and what does it mean? And it's very different in the north to the south. It's often based on this domination, right, which is militarily imposed on populations across the world, the global majority.
Look, farmers are being kicked out. The farmers 2 weeks ago, I've been to the RFC conference 5 years ago. The RFC is very pro-renewables for the Oxford Farming Conference. The farmers last week on podcast, every single one of them said, we want to grow food for the people of the UK. We don't want solar panels on our farm, right? The same thing with the farmers in Ghana and Africa and India. They don't know that their resources and land is being ripped off and stolen from them so we can have a green transition. I don't really know how we're going to address this at the end. I'm not going to be here later. I'd like it addressed now, because the issue is now. That's why I asked the question.
Well,
now.
I kind of did I not?
No.
Did I not just say
you said about minerals.
How all of this
I've asked the question for everyone. Yes.
No, I think it's an important point. I don't think we can just talk to that in this session now. But like, it is something that the last session is about imperialism, specifically because we don't want to invisibilize those imperial relations globally, because that is often just pushed aside. We're talking about invisibilization within like agroecology or within climate movement or whatever, with like socialist politics in the global north. Like, it does often push aside imperialism. Is there anyone who wants to make like a really quick question from the audience? So, yeah, you had your hand last time as well. Quick question and like super quick answers. We've got last couple of minutes. Thank you.
The speakers presented an overview where there seem to be two models, if you can call them that, whereby agroecological production tries to survive in the market. One is super exploiting migrant workers. The other is self-exploitation by people who have some commitment to this alternative model. Now I'm just going to speak about the second, just to be brief. From my research with agroecological initiatives in Latin America, they face the same problem at both the production stage and the distribution stage, including short supply chains. And they joke about it. Say, we don't exploit workers, we exploit ourselves. And it's a kind of badge of pride, but also a problem, because it can't continue indefinitely. Because then there's transience. People come and go. But they accept this, at least temporarily, if the initiative is developing democratic self-management in the framework of a solidarity economy, which has developed as a global mass movement, especially Latin America, really as the global vanguard of this movement. And democratic self-management involves a wide range of skills and commitments and inspirations. So I'm wondering, what is the scope for this self-exploitation here to develop a solidarity economy, which means solidaristic relationships among the producers and with consumer groups organized collectively? That's a long question, but...
Thank you. I'll take one super quick. Okay, go on at the back there. Yeah.
It's kind of a question, but also just like a general comment, because, sorry to be that guy, because we talk about, like, when we talk about building solidarity, for example, between British national agroecological workers and migrant workers, we focus on like the migrant workers being the more vulnerable group, which is completely correct. But equally, we're talking about people who have many of them will come from formerly colonized countries who actually have experience throwing off colonizers off their land and reclaiming their land. Obviously, that's regressed now with neoliberalism, as the gentleman kind of explained. But we're talking about people with actual valuable experience in organizing on the land, around the land. So yeah, kind of going back to your question, how do we essentially rethink the ways that we frame these workers as different, and how they're being differentiated, and rather look at it as, well, who has the sort of like relevant skills and expertise that we could actually bring into the British agroecological movement.
That's a brilliant point. Thank you. Okay, so and the two comments kind of speak a little bit to. I just wanted like have a final comment, like a question to put. To kind of try and wrap these things together, but like it's basically, where do we go from here? What is, and you have like a minute each. I'm sorry, but like, so super quick, like bang. What are we going to do from here, right now, tomorrow? How are we going to change everything? Like, what's a concrete step that we can do? Because my worry is that like agroecology could potentially fall in on itself because of like burnout and like tension and so on, and class power and where that's held. Yeah, so how do we build our solidarities, or where do we go forward, or what are we doing? Sorry, you got a minute or less each.
You ready? Go.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the current work that we're doing alongside the Worker Support Centre. So this is a farm worker organisation in Scotland, and so the project that we're engaged with them is essentially So the Worker Support Centre has connections with a large number of workers who are fed up of how they're being treated. They're fed up of coming over here for 6 months, being treated like rubbish, and going back with not nearly as much money as they expected. And so what the project essentially centres on, there's two halves of it. One is the Worker Support Centre is training up worker activists in order to be able to sort of put forward, centre worker voices, speak up for themselves, speak up for their workmates, tell the truth of what's happening in the agricultural sector. And the other side of it as well is as the Land Workers Alliance is training up our membership and training up, especially as almost like it's a pretty bad way of putting it, but consumer activists. So like people who are able to place pressure on the supermarkets. So there is a demand from the general public in the UK for supermarkets to ensure that workers are paid well, treated well, and that our food is produced under just terms. Again, very much inspired by the Coalition of Markedly Workers experience. So in terms of if you want to get involved in that, if you're interested in that, talk to me, and we're sort of building a little bit of a collective around this. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
I can do mine.
Oh yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. God, I mean, I could say so many different things. I think the thing that comes to mind, particularly thinking of the year ahead, I think at least my personal focus, and I think it will be a focus of SALT's, we have a strategy weekend next week, so you can ask us afterwards, is that I think we're going to be focusing a lot about political education and trying to bring as many of the particularly agroecological workers, but actually land workers more broadly. We are called Solidarity across land trades for a reason. We are not limiting ourselves to agroecology, but what we are going to be trying to address, and we already are trying to address, is how much misunderstanding there is about what a trade union is, what the purpose of joining a trade union is, what workers' organising looks like, what it can achieve, and what we can do when we build class power within the workers' movement. And that's not just within our sector or even adjacent sectors, but it's connecting with wider worker movements and bringing that political education hopefully to more of these workers so they understand their positionality in relation to capital, in relation to their employers, and building that kind of, and doing consciousness raising work in order to bring this worker focus more centrally to these conversations about what is next, what could be next. And whilst I don't have any exemplary models as to what that is, we all are more than aware of all of the pressures that put these small enterprises in what feels like untenable positions. But having said that, I am very aware of projects that have access to wealth and assets and land that are invisibilized in favour of this story about the kind of put upon farmer who is, well, I don't pay myself, so I don't have to pay you well, and that is desperately needs to be problematized. And so my hope is that with SALT's existence and our gaining momentum and gaining more visibility and having these conversations more publicly, that we will be able to bring this more class literate analysis into our conversations about what's next, and to build coalition, but then build radical possibilities based on reality and our lived experience.
All for that. Thank you. Now.
Okay, well, in a minute. So yes to everything everyone said. Don't know what else to say, really. I mean, I think your point about migrant workers is the narrative of them being really vulnerable, right? And actually, migrant workers in the UK have organised so much more militantly than agroecological workers have done, and much more effectively, a much greater history of that. And so I think our capacity when we're predominantly organising agroecological workers right now is to really look to those movements and learn from them, rather than to be we need to be bringing our education to them. And to try and find these areas, as you're talking about, of where we can do that and where these hinges lie. And I haven't got the answer to that right now, definitely not in a minute, but that's something that we're really hoping on achieving. as we say, like within the work with SALT, that's like a core part of who we are, is to not be kind of tunnel visioned on agroecology, but looking at like the nature of the work and the workers and joining that worker-led movement. And I guess to add to that, I would say personally, I'm really interested in changing the idea of what a farmer looks like in the UK and changing that narrative. And that feels really important just in our kind of like dreaming, visionary space as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, all three. If you have questions, you can check them up on the board, or yeah, we can carry on. Do that.
Thanks, Alex.